All right, hi everyone. I am Emily Laubscher. It's really nice to be with you here today. And I'll say, first of all, huge thanks to Connections Beyond Sight and Sound for hosting me. And special thanks to Jen Willis for setting up this opportunity and for helping me prepare. I'm really thrilled to be here today to share some of my work and my thoughts about core vocabulary with all of you. And hopefully, I'll be able to hear from you as well about your experiences and your thinking on this topic. So, the title of this webinar and topic for today is Supporting Language Development for Beginning Communicators Who Require AAC. Where do core words fit in? So, I'll start out with a little bit of background about who I am and how I became interested in this topic. I am Emily Laubscher, as I mentioned. I've been a speech language pathologist for over 15 years now. For 8 of those years, I was a clinician. I worked in the Boston area at an AAC clinic serving primarily children on the autism spectrum with limited speech. And I also worked at a school where my caseload consisted entirely of children who used AAC with mixed profiles. Across all of my work experiences, many of my clients and students were in the early stages of language development. So either just starting to learn about symbolic communication or working on building their vocabulary and their early morphosyntactic skills. So I worked for about 8 years, and at that point, I realized that I still had a lot of questions about how best to support my clients and my students. So I decided to pursue a PhD so that I could develop my skills as a researcher and try to tackle some of those clinical questions. Currently, I work as an assistant professor in the SLP graduate program at Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts. I've been here for about 4 years now. And I also see some private clients on kind of on the weekends to keep up my clinical skills. So, why am I here talking to you about core vocabulary? Well, there came a point in my clinical career, maybe almost 10 years ago now, where I started to notice that core vocabulary was everywhere. I hadn't really learned about it in graduate school, but at some point it suddenly seemed to dominate every corner of the AAC world. And I actually felt very intimidated by it because it seemed to be really important. But I wasn't sure how to fit it in with everything else I'd learned about AAC for the beginning communicators that I worked with. But I wanted to be a good clinician and I wanted to do a good job for the kids and families I was working with. I really wanted to understand core vocabulary and be able to think about it in a more nuanced and informed way. So when I started my doctoral program, that was the first topic that I knew I wanted to tackle. So my talk today attempts to explore what I learned as I kind of dove into this world of core vocabulary for beginning communicators. I'll try to walk you through the questions that I asked and what I found as I attempted to answer them, and I'll share some of the key lessons that I took out of this work along the way. Okay, so because my primary population of interest was and still is beginning communicators, and because that's what we'll be focusing on today, I'll start today's talk by doing just a quick little review of early vocabulary development in children who are typically developing, so who do not use AAC. And then we'll dive into the literature on core vocabulary in AAC. We'll look at how it's been defined and presented in the research literature. Throughout that discussion, I'll share some thoughts about possible clinical implications, and then we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end for anyone who's interested. I also, before I really get started, I want to acknowledge my collaborator on this work, Dr. Janice Light. She was my doctoral advisor when I was a doctoral student at Penn State, and she also was my co-author on the publication that came out of this work. So the publication is cited here for reference because most of the data that I'll present today came from this paper. Okay, so I want to start this talk with a video that's funny. At least it's funny to older millennials like myself, but it also raises, I think, an incredibly important question. What is a good word? So here's the video.
Ready? Yeah. Okay. Hi, it's Rachel and Phoebe's. Please leave. Leave. But I just said leave. Yeah, I know because you have all the good words. What do I get? I get it's and. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a. Forget it. Oh, Phoebe, come on. That's silly. All right, so let's switch. No, I have all the good words. Okay, fine, fine. We can switch. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's Rachel and Phoebe's. Please, wait. How did you do that? What? Oh, you're no ordinary roommate, are you?
Okay, so it's funny, but as we talk today, I would encourage all of you to keep this question in mind. What is a good word? What makes a word important? Important to whom and under what circumstances? Because the term core makes it seem as if there's a single definable set of universally important words. But as we'll see in today's slides, that's actually not the case. So what makes a word important, and especially what makes a word important for a beginning communicator? Throughout the talk, I'll use this term beginning communicator to refer specifically to children who are just beginning to produce their first words or to use symbols in any modality for the first time. They use 50 symbols or fewer, and they are not yet combining those symbols to create original phrases or sentences. For beginning communicators, early vocabulary really matters. At this stage of language development, vocabulary is one of the main areas that we look at to see how language development is going. We can't assess more advanced morphosyntactic skills at this stage because kids aren't demonstrating them yet. They're using single words. So we look at what those words are and how that vocabulary development is going. Typically, children acquire about 50 individual words expressively before they begin to produce word combinations. And then when they do begin to combine words, they use the words that are already in their expressive vocabulary. So that first 50-word vocabulary really serves as a foundation for word combinations and then eventually sets the stage for more advanced grammatical development. So that's all fine and well for children who are learning to use speech, but the picture is more complicated for beginning communicators who rely on AAC. Typically, developing children hear thousands of words, and when they start talking, they can pick and choose whatever they want to say from all of those thousands of words that they've heard. Children who rely on aided AAC have to choose from a selection of words that someone else has picked and provided for them. So one challenge that clinicians and parents and other stakeholders face is, what words do we choose? Even the most robust AAC device out there can't possibly include every word in existence, especially because language is constantly changing and evolving. And even if it could, we would still have all kinds of challenges related to access, navigation, representation, and so on. So we have to make some choices about what words will be available and easy to access. So how do we decide what makes a good word? Well, one way we can tackle this question of what words are important for beginning communicators is to look at vocabulary in typically developing children. So children who don't require AAC, who are learning to use speech. So what do their first words typically look like? So this is some anecdata for you all, but it does kind of maybe get you thinking about first words. These are some examples of first words from children in my life. Maybe you can think of some examples from your own lives. Maybe you remember your own first words, or someone has told you what your own first words were. My daughter, she's first on the list here. So some of the things that she first said when she was just starting to talk included Dada, hi, Susie, who's our dog, Mama, Roar, which was her sound for a dinosaur, because her older brother was really interested in dinosaurs when she was about that age. We had a lot of dinosaur toys and books around, and there was a lot of talk about dinos and a lot of roaring sounds. Milk, Monkey, because we had these little monkey puppets that she really, really loved. Uh-oh. She would say this when she threw things off of her high chair, and then it was funny for her to say, uh-oh, and watch one of us clean everything up. No, bye, and night night for good night. My nephew, who's now 7, these were some of the examples that were among his first words. Wow, yum, pickle, he loved pickles, and Uggies, which was his approximation for Huggies, which is how his family talked about hugs. So if he wanted a hug from mom, he would say, Uggies, Uggies, and she would come and hug him. My son, who's now 5, among his first words were mama and dada, milk, bye, up, to be picked up, turtle, because there was this playground near our house that had some toys kind of scattered around that kids could use. And one of the toys was this little turtle figure. And he was obsessed with this turtle. He would go to the playground and he would go, turtle, turtle. And he would look for it and he would go grab it and he would put it down the slide and just loved this turtle. Buzz, which my son would say when my husband would had like clippers for his hair and he would, cut his hair in the bathroom and the little clippers were like electric and they would make a buzzing sound. And my son was interested in that and would say buzz to talk about the clippers. Duck and quack. He liked to watch the ducks and make duck sounds. And tractor. He was obsessed with tractors. And there is this farm near our house. And there's a tractor there that is always driving around, doing work. So he would love to go to the farm and watch this tractor. And he would point to the tractor and say, quack, 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 which sounds nothing like the actual word tractor, but clearly meant tractor. So maybe you can think of some examples from your own lives, but it will be interesting. We're going to look a little bit more at some specific patterns of what first words look like. And so I would urge you to keep in mind some actual examples from this slide or your own life as we do that. So of course, everyone's exact first words will vary a little bit. But if we look at the literature on early vocabulary development, we can see some general patterns. Typically, developing children who are just starting to talk tend to use more content words than function words. Content words are words that carry meaning, so words that you can easily define. They include things like nouns, action words, descriptive words like adjectives and adverbs. Function words are grammatically important, but harder to define. So they include things like conjunctions, articles, auxiliary verbs. Function words are like the glue that holds a sentence together, but they don't provide as much information about the topic. And then first words are relevant to the child's personal experiences and interests. Kids talk about what they know, what they experience in their daily lives, the things that are meaningful and important to them as they play and eat and get dressed in the morning and ride to school and so on. They talk about the people in their lives, pets, places they go, favorite toys, routines and concepts that are important to the family culture, like my nephew saying Uggies or my daughter using our dog's name. Um, in addition to using more content words than function words, Young children, when they just start to speak, tend to use a lot of nouns and especially object names. They also tend to talk about items that are particularly salient in their world. This includes things that are easy to sense and easy to notice. So things that move, things that are big, things that make a lot of noise, things that can be directly acted upon by the child. So children can hold them and touch them and experience them and explore their sensory properties. And also, interestingly, sound effects and animal sounds tend to feature very prominently in early vocabularies. One thing that we don't typically see a lot of in early vocabularies is function words. So these are words that play a critical role in more advanced grammar, but they're not common in children's early expressive vocabularies. And this is in spite of the fact that they are the most frequent type of word used by adults, which makes sense because these words are really important in terms of making grammatically correct sentences. Conjunctions, articles, auxiliary verbs, pronouns. We use these types of words over and over and over again, no matter what topic we're talking about. We need them to be able to form sentences. Once we are using grammar, these words are really critical, but beginning communicators don't typically use them very often. Okay, so we've kind of set the stage. We know that vocabulary is important in early language development. We know we need to think carefully about the words that beginning communicators who use AAC have access to. And we know a little bit about what first words typically look like. So now let's turn our attention to core vocabulary specifically. Beginning with possibly the most fundamental question, which is what exactly is core vocabulary? This was the first thing that I set out to do when I began this work, was to just define core vocabulary. And as it turns out, there are actually a lot of ways to think about that question of what makes a word a core word. The concept of a core vocabulary is actually not unique to the field of AAC. Other professions have thought about what a core vocabulary might look like. And it turns out that defining a set of core words is quite difficult to do. You quickly run into annoying questions like, what is a word? So do words like can't and wanna count as one word or two? And also, what language corpus are we even talking about when we try to decide which words are core? So, are we talking about core words for all of English? For only American English? Are we talking only about spoken language or written language or both? What about dialects? And so on. So, researchers and practitioners across multiple fields have defined core vocabulary in various ways. And I've listed some examples here from a paper by Lee, 2001. So you can get a sense from looking at these bullets here of all the different ways that researchers have attempted to define a core vocabulary. So one way is to talk about the most frequent words in the language as a whole. Although then you run into the problem of what cutoff do you use? Do you take the top 10 words? Do you take the top 5,000 words? Do you go to more than that, somewhere in between those two numbers? So researchers have also defined core words as the most frequent words in a particular medium, so in spoken language or in written language. Some have defined it, core words, as the most frequent words for a particular demographic grouping. So you can look at the most frequent words used by 5-year-olds or by people over the age of 80. You can look at the most frequent words in a particular socioeconomic status or group, in a particular geographic location. And you can quickly see how this could go on and on. Some researchers have defined core vocabulary as words that are the most general or unmarked or central to the language. So words like bird would be considered core, but not robin because that's too specific. Another example is words useful for dictionary definitions. So this is just kind of a taste of all the possible ways to define core vocabulary. And you can see that it's not easy to do, and there are lots of ways to do it. So again, we come back to this question of what makes a word important. I also included this quote from the Lee 2001 paper because I really love it and I think it really sums up the problem or the challenge here. So Lee says, the notion of a core vocabulary of English is one that would seem to be intuitively plausible and uncontroversial. For many linguists and language teachers, the idea of the existence of a common central core of lexical items is taken almost for granted, even if an explicit inventory of such words cannot be agreed on so readily. Indeed, there is no universally accepted ready-made list of the core words of the English language to be found. Okay, so there are lots of ways to think about what makes a word important. There's no single definitive list of core words, and core depends on how you define it. So what about in the AAC literature? Broadly speaking, in AAC, core vocabulary is defined as words that occur frequently or that are commonly used by many individuals. These are often contrasted with fringe words or fringe vocabulary, which are specific to an individual or an activity. Many AAC devices and page sets are designed to prioritize core words. And there are also entire instructional programs, symbol sets, pre-made materials, lesson plans, and so on that emphasize core words or provide tricks and tips on how to teach them. These are widely available online. So in light of all of this, the importance of early vocabulary, the nature of typical first words, the challenge of choosing meaningful and important words for AAC users to access as they're just starting to express themselves, I wondered, where do core words fit in? And I asked these specific questions. How exactly are core word lists developed in AAC? We know that core depends on how you define it, so who decided which words belonged on AAC core word lists and how exactly did they do it? Which words are actually on the lists? And then lastly, are the words on those AAC core vocabulary lists similar to the types of words that we would expect to see beginning communicators use? And I tackled that last question by comparing published core word lists to a validated inventory of early expressive vocabulary. So now I'm going to try to talk through each of these questions and share my findings along with some clinical considerations. Beginning with how are core word lists developed in AAC? So to answer this question, I conducted a review of published peer-reviewed studies that explicitly aimed to identify core word lists for young children for the purposes of informing AAC intervention. Studies were included in the review if the participants were 6 years old or younger, because I was interested in early language development, beginning communicators, so I wanted to look at research on young children. Participants needed to speak English, and I also focused specifically on spoken language. So I excluded any studies that attempted to identify core words in written texts. Okay. My review located 5 studies. So they're listed here, and then the full citations are also in the reference list linked at the end of these slides if you'd like to check them out. Okay, so what did the authors do in these studies? So across these 5 studies, the most common method of identifying core words was to audio record language samples from the participants within a defined period of time or defined context, like recess or free time in the classroom. And then analyze those audio recordings, those recorded language samples, to determine which words were used most frequently or most commonly by all of the participants. Those frequent or common words were then presented as a list of core words at the end of the study. There was one very important exception, which was the Friedogen and Moore study, which did collect language samples, but those authors also sought input from parents and other stakeholders about the words that their children might need or want to say. So there were language samples plus input from stakeholders in that study. There was a wide range of sample sizes in these papers, the sample size being the number of child participants from which these language samples were collected. The smallest study had 6 participants, and the largest had 50. And it was also notable that 3 out of the 5 studies had 10 participants or less. So we're not looking at enormous sample sizes here. In all of the studies, the children were at least 2 years old, and most of them were older than that. And the children from whom the language samples were collected in these studies all had typical language development. So these children are not AAC users. These studies used language samples from typically developing children to develop core word lists to inform AAC intervention. The Friedogen and Moore study did include children with disabilities, but no language samples were collected from them. So the core word lists developed in each study varied in length quite a lot. The shortest list included only 23 words, and the longest had 332. That's a pretty big difference. And then there was everything in between. So, given that there were relatively small sample sizes in these studies, one thing we might wonder is how well do these results really generalize? Just because a small number of children in a particular context used these 23 words a lot, does that mean that those 23 words are somehow also fundamentally core for my child or my client or my student? And it's also worth noting that there is pretty substantial variability in the length of these lists, ranging from 23 at the low end to 332 words at the high end. So are there 23 core words? Are there 332 core words? Is it some number in between these values? These answers are not clear. These studies attempted to somehow aggregate the language samples to get an overall picture of common, frequently occurring words across the samples. So they took all of the words that were produced by all of the children in their study. They made a giant master list of kind of all the words. And then based on that collection of all words contributed, they figured out which ones were most frequent or most common. What gets lost with this approach is that focus on the individual variation that is so common in early vocabularies. So beginning communicators, if you recall from our discussion of typical language development, they use words that are interesting to them, that are personally relevant, that are salient in their environments, and sometimes that are idiosyncratic, like with the Uggies example for hugs. So this approach to analysis that is taken in the majority of these studies doesn't really capture that individual variability because it's looking for frequency and commonality across multiple language samples and participants. And then a final consideration is that the participants who provided the language samples from which the majority of these core word lists were derived were actually not beginning communicators. They were almost all typically developing children over the age of 24 months who you would expect them at that point to be using at least early word combinations, if not more advanced grammar. So this might lead us to wonder, can these lists speak in any way to the words that are frequent, common, or important for some other reason for beginning communicators when the lists don't come from beginning communicators to begin with? Okay, so we're seeing that maybe the methods used to identify lists of core words to inform vocabulary selection for AAC users results in lists that maybe don't fully reflect the types of words that beginning communicators might want and need to use, but we still need to ask, what are the actual words that end up on these lists? So, in the 5 studies of young children that I reviewed, the authors used 2 main criteria to determine which words from their language samples got to be considered core. The first was frequency. So, in 3 of the studies, words ended up on the core word list if they were used at least once in every 2,000 words within the total aggregated language sample. So, all of the words used by all of the participants all lumped together, once in every 2,000 words. The other criterion was commonality across participants or language samples. So, in one study, a word was considered core if it was used by at least 3 participants. And in that study, there were 6 total participants, so this equated to 50% of the participants. In one study, a word was considered core if it occurred in at least 4 out of 6 different sampling contexts. So in that study, language samples were collected from children as they did a number of different activities, resulting in multiple language samples per child representing different communication contexts. So core words were those that were used in at least 4 out of those 6 contexts. And then in one study, a word was considered core if it appeared on at least 3 out of 90 source lists. So this was the Friedhogen and Moore study. In that study, the authors collected language samples and also asked stakeholders to report words they thought would be important. This resulted in a bunch of lists coming from the language samples and also contributed by the stakeholders for a total of 90 lists across the study. And if a word appeared on at least 3 of those lists, it got to be considered a core word. So it's a little bit interesting to note that, at least in these studies, core words don't actually have to be all that frequent or common to be considered core. So what words are captured using these methods? Well, it turns out that every core word list is different. There's variation across the lists, and no 2 lists are identical. It's also really difficult to quickly summarize the lists, especially the longer ones, because after a while they end up feeling like just kind of a random collection of words. However, 4 out of the 5 studies in this review presented their core word lists in order from most to least core. So, depending on how core was defined, this means that the words were ranked from most frequent to least frequent, or most common to least common, for example. So, these ranked lists can give us some idea of what types of words are most likely to be captured when you look at frequency and commonality of occurrence across language samples. Okay, so bear with me a little bit as I try to talk through this. We have 4 lists that ranked words from most to least core. Those are listed across the top of the slide here, the top of the table. These lists are long, so for ease of discussion, we can look at just the top 100 words on each list. So if you take the top 100 words on each of these ranked lists and combine them all together, you get a total of 165 different words. Out of those 165 words, about half of them appear on only one of the core lists, and only 18 of them appear on all four of the lists. So this table here shows the 18 words that are on all four of the ranked lists. So we can see from this analysis that core word lists are all different and actually quite substantially different from one another. There are very few words that appear on all of the lists, and almost half of the words appear on only one list. So we're left with this question of which one is the right list. The word core implies some kind of universal importance, but if all of these lists are so different from one another, which one contains the true core words? So then, when we zoom in even a little more and look at the top 10 most core words across these ranked lists, we can also get a sense of the types of words that tend to be identified as most core. So this table shows all of the words that appear in the top 10 on any one of the four ranked core word lists. The words themselves are listed here in the left-hand column. These numbers in the middle all represent the ranking of each word within each one of the lists. But I especially want to draw your attention over to the two columns on the right that are outlined in red and yellow. So the second column from the right, outlined in red, indicates whether each of these words is a function word or not. So function words are those little words that are really important for holding sentences together. And here we've also included grammatical morphemes in that category. So plural S, for example, if that was coded by the authors as a word, that was considered a function word. And then also remember that these words are not common in early expressive vocabularies. But we can see here in this column that a fairly sizable number of these most core words on these lists are function words. So it ends up being about 63% of the words are function words, with the remainder being content words shown over here. And then on the far right, so in the column outlined in yellow, this column shows the age in months at which 50% of children with typical development produce the word. So obviously every child is different, but these ages here in months can give us a sense of about when we would expect use of each word to emerge. So we've got our words over here, and we can see the first word on the list is dad. And so the age at which 50% of typically developing children say that word is 12 months. The first three words on this list are dad, mom, and no. All of those are produced by 15 months of age. So 12 months or 1 year old for dad and mom, 15 months for no. All of the rest of the words, so the majority, about 88% of these words, are typically produced after the age of 18 months. So we see 19 months, 19 months, 19 months, 20 months, and so on, all the way down the column. So this is important because 18 months is the age at which we would see children just starting to combine words. So At that point, they are no longer beginning communicators. They're moving out of the first word stage. They're now into semantic relations and early word combinations. So if we look at this data, by the time kids start to produce most of these core words, they are no longer beginning communicators. They're now moving on to semantic relations. All right, so let's try to pull all of this together a little bit. So, first of all, we can see from this breakdown that when core word lists rank the words from most to least core, or most to least frequent or common, depending on how core is defined, the words at the top of the list are often function words, which are not common in early vocabularies. And these words tend to be produced starting after the first word stage, once children are no longer beginning communicators. So it seems like perhaps these core word lists are not doing a great job of capturing the types of words that beginning communicators are likely to want to use expressively. So does that mean that all core words are inappropriate for beginning communicators? Well, no, definitely not. And in fact, the words dad and mom appeared on most of the core word lists, and those are obviously incredibly important and useful words for beginning communicators. But what these data do suggest is that the words on these core word lists, or I guess I should say, the words that these lists are doing a really good job of capturing are not necessarily words we would expect a beginning communicator to express. So we could grab any of these lists and we could go through it and we could pick and choose the words that would be developmentally appropriate and useful for beginning communicators. But we would end up having to sort through a lot of words that are later developing or irrelevant. And it makes me wonder if maybe there's a more efficient way to go about choosing vocabulary for beginning communicators who require AAC. All right, so far we've compared the top words on core vocabulary lists to the types of words that we know beginning communicators tend to use. And it seems like the theoretical foundation for using these lists with beginning communicators could be stronger. So what if we actually go in and compare the words on these core vocabulary lists to a validated inventory of first words? Would we also find concerns? So this is the third question that I asked. Do core word lists align with validated inventories of first words? I chose to compare core word lists to the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories, or the MCDI. This is a validated inventory of early language, including vocabulary. It includes two forms for two different age groups, capturing an overall age range of 8 to 30 months. There's a form for the earlier half of that range, and then a separate form for the later half of that range. Each of the forms includes a list of actual words used by beginning communicators, developed and validated over decades of research. The word list on each form is divided into categories. So, for instance, toys, household items, action words, games, people, etc. And then there are words listed within each category. So we can compare the words on the MCDI to core word lists in order to determine how well they match. And I did this by basically just calculating the total number of words on the MCDI and then determining how many of those words appeared in the top 100 on at least one core vocabulary list. Basically, I just wanted to see if there was a lot of overlap between these two types, between the MCDI and the core word lists or not. All right, so this table lists the MCDI word categories in the left-hand column over here. So we can see sound effects and animal sounds, animal names, vehicles, toys, food and drink, and so on. So that's in the left. And then there are some examples of words, actual words in each category in this second column from the left. So in the sound effects and animal sounds category, some of the example words were ba and choo-choo for a train. Okay, so then moving left to right across the table. This column, outlined in red, compares the MCDI words and gestures form. So this is the form for the younger age group to core word lists. So you can see here the total number of words for each category on the MCDI. That's this total column here. And then the total number of those words that appear in the top 100 on the ranked core word lists. That's here. So for example, in the sound effects and animal sounds category, there are 12 words, pointing to the top number here, on the MCDI within that category on that form. And none of those words, so 0 of them, appear in the top 100 on any ranked core word list. And you can kind of follow this column down for more examples. So if we look at animal names, there are 36 words on the MCDI in that category for the younger age range. One of them is in the top 100 on at least one core word list. Okay, so then let's see. Oh, okay. So then we have similar data presented over here on the far right in this column outlined in yellow. So this column is for the MCDI words and sentences form. So this is the form for the slightly older age group, up to 30 months. And it presents similar data. So for each category, how many total words are there on the MCDI? And of those total words, how many appear on at least one ranked core word list? So overall, for the words and gestures form, that's the younger age range, that's the red box here. There are 396 total words across all the categories. So if we add up all this whole total, of those 396 total words, 79 of them, or 20% of them, appear in the top 100 of ranked core word lists. On the words and sentences form for slightly older children, there are 680 total words on the MCDI, and 122 of them, or about 18%, appear in the top 100 of ranked core word lists. So we can see a similar problem when we look at the actual words produced by beginning communicators. There's this mismatch between the words on this validated inventory of first words, the MCDI, and the words on core vocabulary lists developed for young children. There's not a ton of overlap. And in fact, about 80% of the words on the MCDI do not appear in the top 100 words on the ranked core vocabulary lists. So this suggests to me that we need to be really cautious about relying on these core vocabulary lists for beginning communicators, because we might miss a lot of words that are really important and meaningful and powerful at this early stage of development. All those words on the MCDI that aren't necessarily captured on the core word lists, or that maybe are captured but come much further down on the list and are maybe only captured by the very long lists that include lots and lots of words. All right, so to kind of just again try to summarize and kind of pull some of these ideas together. So if we remember what we know about typical language development, we know that first words are personally relevant. We know they might be idiosyncratic. They tend to include more content words than function words, especially nouns, especially object labels. But the core word lists, at least the ones that were developed for young children reviewed in this study, tend to emphasize function words that emerge after the beginning communicator stage. And they also, in the analysis approach that the authors have taken, for the most part, what's happened with this approach is that we end up with core word lists that are a summary of many language samples all combined together. So that means that these core word lists are not reflecting the words used by a particular individual child. These methods lose that emphasis on individual variation and the uniqueness of early vocabulary that's such a hallmark of first words. So I started this talk with a question: what makes a word important? And one of the things that I've learned as I've read these studies and looked at these lists and tried to answer the questions that I talked through today is that the answer is not the same for every population or for every individual. The core word lists in these studies capture something important about the vocabulary of those participants that were sampled in those particular contexts at that particular point in time. But are those the words that are important for all beginning communicators or all children for that matter? My research would suggest that the answer is likely no, given what we know about early language development. It seems likely that if we rely heavily on these core word lists, there's a risk that we're going to miss out on a lot of really important words that are reflective of the types of words that tend to be used by beginning communicators. So then we're left with the question of, okay, if core word lists are not the best resource for selecting vocabulary and instructional targets for beginning communicators, then what do we do instead? Is there a better way to figure out what words are important for this population and for the individuals that we're supporting? One thing we can do as a starting point is to think about the types of words that we know beginning communicators tend to use. We know early words are personally relevant. They relate to the activities and routines that make up that child's daily life. They often code for things that are particularly salient to the child, things the child can sense, things that are big or loud, or have an interesting texture. They include lots of content words, especially nouns, but also action words, descriptive words, sound effects, animal sounds. So we can start with that. And then we can personalize our vocabulary selection from there. And the MCDI actually gives us a great place to start because it lays out those categories for us. It's a great validated inventory of first words that gives us a starting point. We have these categories, we have some common words within those categories, but we can also use those categories as a jumping off point to work with families to identify personally relevant words for each child. So, okay, hey, let's talk about food and drink. What are the types of what are your child's, favorite foods, things that they drink on a regular basis? What words do you think are really important to include in this category? So this is a great starting point. There are many, many other vocabulary selection techniques that our field has relied on for decades. It's sort of, I think, beyond the scope of this webinar to try to go into all of them, but if anyone would like more information about those, I'd be happy to share some resources. You can send me an email and I'd be happy to pass them along. I want to acknowledge some important limitations of this work, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion if people have questions or comments. First of all, this discussion and this literature considered only the very early stages of language development, the first word stage. Once children begin to combine words and use phrases and sentences, their expressive vocabulary needs change. Function words in particular become really important at that point, and it's possible that these core word lists might be more useful at that stage, either on their own or in combination with other vocabulary selection techniques. This work focused only on expressive vocabulary. I thought about this issue from an expressive communication perspective. So, what words are beginning communicators likely to need and want to use? But children are typically provided with a lot of language input before they start to express themselves, whether that is spoken language input or modeling of AAC systems or both. As they experience language input around them, they build their language comprehension, and comprehension then serves as a foundation for expression. This review did not ask questions about what language input or aided AAC modeling should look like for beginning communicators who require AAC. It only considered what words they might want to express. And then lastly, and this is a really important one, this work used a typical developmental model to help inform our thinking about language and intervention for AAC users who are having often a very different language learning experience than children who are learning to talk. There's a wonderful paper by Gerber and Kratt from 1992. It's old, but still really, really important, that outlines some of the limitations of this approach of using a typical development model. But despite those limitations, we also do not have any evidence in the literature to suggest that early vocabulary is somehow fundamentally different for children who require AAC. The specific words that the children use might differ because they're having different life experiences. So, what they see and what they hear and how they interact with the world might be different, but the types of words that they tend to use are not, or at least they don't seem to be based on current evidence. So I'll end this part of the webinar by, I guess, answering my own question. What makes a word important? It depends. It depends on the context. It depends on individual interests and needs. And as we saw today, it depends on language level too. There's no single list of words that's going to meet the needs of every learner. And beginning communicators in particular need a highly personalized approach to selection of vocabulary targets. Core word lists have been typically developed by aggregating language samples across a group of participants, most of whom are not beginning communicators, which is almost the opposite of this personalized approach. We might be more likely to capture words that are actually important to beginning communicators using other methods. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up the slides here, and we have all of the remaining time for questions and discussion. I'll also just mention before I stop sharing my slides that this is my email, emily.laubscher@regiscollege.edu. If you have questions, if you're interested in resources, if you have a comment, if you have feedback in general, I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to reach out. And I think maybe with that, I'll stop sharing the slides. Is that okay? And then if people have questions or just want to talk about anything, please feel free to yell.
This is Jen. I hope that people will start joining into a conversation. I know this is a very important and highly discussed topic. So I am hoping that some people might have some comments. While you're thinking, though, on that, while we have everybody, I am going to put up the poll just as our evaluation. So if everybody could please complete the evaluation for us, that would be really helpful for our grant purposes. And if people are interested in receiving a certificate, one will be sent out after the presentation in an email along with the slides from today's presentation and the article that Emily highlighted in the beginning. So I will attach all of those. To start off the conversation, I guess, I think I'd just like to make a comment that we invited Emily today. I wanted her to present on this topic because this information, as she presented it, for all students is so important. This is a highly controversial topic sometimes, and the research and the information in and of itself as it's presented is critical and important. But then when we kind of narrow it down to the students that we serve, who may be deaf and hard of hearing or deaf blind, being able to take the research and the information that she presented and apply it, there are some really critical pieces of that. Um, Especially looking at the fact that the research was conducted on all children who were hearing, right? Meaning that they had access, full access to spoken language receptively from the beginning, right? So that is a critical factor for our students who are deaf blind or just deaf and hard of hearing, in that we're already one step back with what vocabulary is going to be chosen, because it's going to be limited based on the experiences that that child has had, the vocabulary that they have had exposure to through sign language, and the fact that it's going to be limited compared to a hearing child who has had access to spoken language. Except if we're talking about a deaf child from a deaf family, right, who has had that initial consistent exposure. Um, and so word choice, I think one of the critical pieces that I took away from your presentation, Emily, was stating that vocabulary needs to be personally relevant and salient in their environment, right? And so then, especially even when we look even further at our children who are deaf blind, what is salient in their environment might be even more limited
Right. Yeah.
and unique to their situation. Um, and when we talk about core vocabulary and how so much of that vocabulary is very abstract too, for our children who are deaf blind, often we are trying to choose those first vocabulary to be something that can pair with something very concrete,
Mhm.
an object or an image or something that is very concrete, because the whole purpose is using, we're building from something concrete, an object, an experience, something tangible or visual, to we're pairing it with something abstract, which is a word or spoken word or a
Right.
sign, and helping them make that connection. So this
Yeah.
was very, very informative today, and I hope people take a lot away from what you presented, and that helps hopefully drive IEP goal development, and really just thinking about what vocabulary is chosen for our students when they first start using AAC, or different forms of communication.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, and I think one of the things that I feel like has happened over the last decade or so of clinical practice, as core has become such an overwhelming trend, I almost feel like nouns have become vilified. Like if you're teaching nouns, you are a bad clinician because nouns are limiting. And if you teach only nouns, kids will only ever be able to ask for things. And it's so not true. I mean, if we look at what kids do with nouns when they first start to use symbols, they don't just request, they use nouns to comment, to share, to engage in social interaction. And if we look at the types of words that are really common in early vocabularies, it's nouns and object labels. And so one thing that maybe I can give all of you is just permission to really focus on those words that are concrete and salient for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, who are deaf-blind, who have these sensory experiences that are very, very different from hearing children. Um, that was important for me as a clinician, as a kind of one of my learning outcomes from all of this was to realize that not only are nouns perfectly fine and really important for everyone, they are actually critically important for beginning communicators because these nouns and other content words, they code for concepts, right? And you need a body of language concepts individually before you can start to combine them, right? So to even get to the point where you're using word combinations and more advanced grammar, you first need a whole bunch of building blocks. And for beginning communicators, those building blocks are content words. So if we focus too much on really abstract concepts, function words, the types of words that these core vocabulary lists are really good at capturing, if we focus too much on them, what are we not giving kids? How are they ever going to develop that first 50-word lexicon that's heavy on content so that they can put concepts together to start to develop grammar, right? So, yeah, nouns are not only okay, they are critical, actually.
Thank you. We have a one long question in the chat box. So would you like me to read it out to you?
I can
Would
read
that be?
it. Yeah, I might read it out loud if that's okay, because I
Yes,
can
that would be
process in
great.
real time.
And
Okay.
catch the recording.
Do you have any suggestions for SLPs working with a student who is nonverbal and their only reliable means of communication is an AAC device, but their parents don't cooperate with the SLP in terms of the device? In meetings, they have expressed they don't want to use it because they don't want it to replace spoken language, even after being told it helps facilitate the growth of language overall. This has put a little delay in trying to obtain information on what core words might be more salient for the student. Do you have any suggestions? Well, I don't know that I have specific suggestions for this specific individual, but I will say that this issue of being worried about visual supports or an AAC device because it might replace spoken language, I think is really common. I bet a lot of us here have run into this before. Um, so there actually has been a fair amount of research on this, and we now have a number of individual studies as well as systematic reviews that have tried to answer this question of will spoken language be impacted if we introduce aided AAC? And the good news for people who want to prioritize spoken language is that when we introduce AAC across these studies and in these systematic reviews, the consistent finding has been that AAC does not interfere, does not reduce the use of speech, and actually, for some kids, can lead to increased use of speech. So I don't know if that's useful information to share with the family. Um, I feel like sometimes having that conversation, just maybe kind of acknowledging that, yeah, hey, I understand, you want your child to be able to communicate in lots of different ways, and speech is valuable for many, many reasons. And, we never want to discourage any mode of communication that's helpful. But the good news when it comes to speech is that research suggests that we don't need to worry about speech decreasing when we introduce AAC. Did that answer the question? Um, okay, well, we can talk more if that didn't answer the question. They still continue to refuse to use the device. Other things that sometimes have worked for me is if you can show them. Sometimes it's hard to get FaceTime with a family depending on where you work. If you're in a school, families usually aren't right there in your sessions, but sometimes being able to show the family that it's helpful to have the device there and they can actually see their kid communicating in new ways and making progress when the device is present. Sometimes that can be helpful. Um, at the end of the day, it is the family's choice. And if they're uncomfortable with AAC, we can't force them to use it. But I think sharing research is always great and showing progress. I think it tends to be really, I think, powerful for parents when they see their kids doing amazing things and making progress and communicating successfully. So um, that's the other piece of advice that comes to mind. I'm going to keep going with the questions in the chat if that's okay. Okay, so I know having an AAC layout that is the same is pivotal for motor memory. However, most SLPs I've worked with want to use the basic universal core board that often doesn't have language the beginning communicator won't use. Would you encourage having an individualized AAC layout focused on nouns, and then when the child grows in vocabulary, then move to the universal AAC core? Yeah. It's so complicated. It's so complicated, and I don't think that I can advise really on individual students, but um, yeah, I mean, I kind of think about this as like a universal core board often does contain words that are useful across contexts, environments, conversation topics. But for me, it always comes back to communication should be fun and it should be easy. And if the thing that a child needs to be able to communicate successfully, to engage, to connect, to be part of a social interaction, to take an active role in that social interaction, if the thing the child needs to be able to do that is a display with some really concrete symbols, maybe a lot of nouns, maybe a topic display with words all related to one topic, if that's the thing that's going to support participation, then I think that's a really great thing. And like, yes, it's not this robust system of words that are going to meet every communication need that this child has from now until eternity in every possible context. But they can use it and it's helpful and they can connect and engage and communicate and be successful and feel successful. And I think that also is really, really important. What is communication about? It's about connection, right? So I always try to kind of think about when I get into these very muddy waters of, oh, but it doesn't build grammar. Oh, but it's specific to this one context. What are they going to do when they go home and they don't have it anymore? I always kind of try to come back to what is going to help this child have a positive and successful communication experience. And even if it's not the perfect tool, it's at least the perfect tool for right now. And then we can think about building, kind of as you mentioned. Yeah. I hope I'm answering these questions all right. These are really hard questions. I feel like every AAC SLP struggles with this stuff. So other people jump in if you have other ideas too.
And we still have the poll. We still got it. If people could please, hopefully people are seeing it.
There's a question that just came into the chat. Which form of AAC would you suggest for a child who has profound hearing loss and low vision? So I would actually defer this question because I feel like it is a little bit outside of my area of expertise. And I would suspect that maybe actually Jen or someone else here could probably answer this more effectively than I could because my answer probably would be it depends on the child. So I am going to defer that one if that's okay because I don't want to give a bad answer that points you in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean it's absolutely individualized to the child. It depends on age and their language level, but we are often starting initially with concrete objects, and then possibly moving to some partial symbols or different, as the child develops some symbolism. But it's a lot of low tech, usually with our deafblind students, is usually where we start. Because also low vision is that ocular low vision? Is that a child with CVI? Is also things that we need to take into consideration. What is that child's visual acuity and ability to access, say, maybe a device or visual images? That's definitely going to impact their use of AAC. So usually we are starting more low tech in whatever variation that's looking like. And however, the receptive piece, this is all for expressive, right? Receptively, language input still needs to be a thing. So receptively is determining what modality does that child have access to for us to provide robust, complete, full exposure to language? So that's either going to be probably spoken language or sign language, either in the form of visual or tactile, so that they are getting access to language. These other things that we use with objects and visual supports or picture symbols and all of that stuff are tools. They're additions to using language to support communication and again to bridge that concrete and foundational communication with abstract concepts or words. Um, so, but yes, again, it does depend on what that individual child's needs are. There are a lot of, if we're looking at AAC for children who are deafblind, there is a lot of webinars and things either on our website or YouTube page that we have created. The National Center on Deaf Blindness and Paths to Literacy also has a ton of webinars and resources around communication development for children who are deafblind. Oh no, so the poll didn't actually, well, it went up and then apparently disappeared for people. Maybe I try it again. Maybe I can try launching it. Relaunch. Let's try that. I'm not going to touch anything. So Lydia, I don't know if that helped at all. If you want some more resources shared or how we can help you along that line. Oh yay, poll is working now. Woohoo! Thank you all.
Yeah, Jen, I appreciate your response to that question. As with everything with AAC, I mean, we use the term complex communication needs when we refer to people who use AAC a lot of the time, and it really is complex. And when it's always complex, and then when you're talking about students or children who are deafblind, it's even more complex because we're talking about so many different communication modalities. We're thinking about input, we're thinking about expression, we're thinking about vocabulary selection, which is kind of this very tiny piece of the puzzle that we focused on today. But there's so much more than just what words do we need, it's how do we represent those words? How do we combine those words eventually? How do we teach them receptively? Um, this kind of vocabulary selection question is just one little piece of the puzzle, and it is very complex. So yeah.
Yeah. And recognizing that AAC is not designed to teach language. There are the ASHA website even, talks about it can be AAC can be used to support both receptive and expressive language, but that's for children who are getting full exposure receptively to a complete language, right? And then we're using AAC to assist in modeling receptively how someone would use AAC to communicate in order to help encourage and promote the use expressively by the child. But for a child who is not getting access to language auditorily, AAC by itself is not designed to teach language.
Right. Yeah, we sometimes refer to AAC systems as language systems, and I always kind of pause when I hear that because it really isn't designed to be a language system per se. It's a code for language. So it is interesting to think about how that works differently when you have a spoken language that you've been hearing and learning receptively versus when you don't have that because of sensory differences. Yeah, there was a comment in the chat. Yes, I just read an article that a child needs a first language first before getting AAC. Yeah, I think it is such an interesting question to think about. Like, what are we teaching when we model AAC? Are we somehow hoping that the child will encode language directly through the AAC system? Or are we teaching them how to use a code for a language that they already know receptively? It's such a provocative question for me, and um, I'm not sure where to start tackling it, but yeah, the answer might be different depending on the population. So it's, yeah, lots of interesting questions to explore out there.
This is Jen. I was just going to type, but Emily, if you remember the name of that article or could share it, I'd love to read that. I'm not sure if anybody else would, but I'd be very interested in that.
Same.